The Arabs claimed that, and this was also nonsense, that the Jews had, with predetermination in line with a planning and policy, had expelled the 700,000 from their homes. And myself, having investigated this over years, looking at the documentation and so on, I see that that's not correct. There was no master plan. There was no systematic expulsion. Most of the Arabs simply fled in face of encroaching battle. A unit comes to a village, wants to capture it. It shells the village lightly. The Israelis didn't have much artillery. They used mortars. And the Palestinians fled the village. And then later, the Israelis did not allow the villagers or the townspeople to return. That's the expulsive part of what happened. But there was no general order or plan or policy to expel the Arabs systematically. And a good proof of this, incidentally, is that about 20% of Israel's population at the end of the 48 war was Arab. Arabs, 20% of Israel's citizens at the end of the war were Arabs, given Israeli ID cards, Israeli citizenship, and so on. And had there been a master plan and a consistent policy of expulsion, I don't think these 20% would have remained. And Israel, incidentally, today, with its 9 million or so population, 21% or 22% of its population is Arabs, Arab citizens of the State of Israel. And about 78% or 77% are Jews. And all of this is because there was no master plan or consistent policy of expulsion in 48, in my view.
Okay, there's so much interesting there to talk about. First, something of a meta question. I mean, you said that after the War of 48, there was a lot of, and maybe even getting closer to the present, there's been a lot of debate over the numbers of the Palestinians who were expelled. On the low end, 500,000, but it settled
not
on...
expelled. The Palestinians who were uprooted. That's the phrase I would use, the phrase driven out. Palestinians were, on large, driven out. This is what really happened. But most of them fled from battle and weren't allowed back. A small number were expelled. And a small number were urged out by their own people.
But the number was settled around 700,000. And this is just a problem that I have had as I've been doing research on these topics for these conversations too, is that different historians, and it seems like this is particularly problematic for the Israel-Palestine conflict, just because of how emotionally charged it is and how invested the historians are, often on one side or the other. But different authors will cite very different numbers and very different figures to back up their claims. So I can imagine, even if 700,000 is the agreed upon number, there are some very ardent Zionist historians who might, just as an example, cite the 500,000 number, or pro-Palestinian historians who will cite the million, like a million number. And it's just very varying. And I'm wondering how, as a non-historian, well, you're an historian, obviously, but how, as a non-historian, as I am, or many of our listeners, you would recommend that we go about reading and learning about these situations when the historians themselves are citing such different figures, and it's very difficult to know who is right and who is wrong and who is being genuine when you haven't done the research yourself.
I wouldn't say the historians are citing different numbers. I would say, by and large, historians agree more or less on the 750,000. Arabs and Israelis today agree on this. But propagandists, journalists, non-scholars do talk about, still perhaps in Israel, 500,000 or 600,000, and on the Arab side, as I say, 900,000 or 1 million. But this isn't really a debate among scholars. I'm saying scholars can move between 700 and 750,000. I think Arabs would more or less agree to that. figures, the 500,000 and the million, basically are propagandistic. The Israeli government and spokesman trying to lower the figure, which would mean Israel was less responsible for the what happened, and Arabs saying it was 1 million. So the Israelis are even more evil than presented if the numbers are lower. That seems to be the argument, but it's a propaganda argument, not really an argument among scholars. Among scholars, there are real arguments about the causes of the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. That's a real debate among experts as well.